event. This year's the premium sponsors for this event includes the Knight Foundation, OHL, Royal Caribbean, the Bachelor Foundation, the DeGroote Foundation. I also like to give a special welcome to friends of the book fair. How many of you are friends? Wow, okay. Thank you so much for your generous support for the book fairs. For those of you who are not a friend yet, we invite you to join the family as a friend for the book fair. And I would also like to give a shout out to Miami-Dade College as the sponsor for this event. Miami-Dade College, for the last 60 years, Miami-Dade College has been offering high quality and affordable education programming for the community. So we invite you to check it out, our over 300 degree programs. You can find more at www.miami.mdc.edu. So we're going to, we had three outstanding best-selling authors going to join us in the next hour, and each of them are going to talk about their new book, and then after they dump their talk, we're going to open up for the audience to ask questions. And at the end of the section, all three authors will also be autographing their book downstairs in the atrium at the autographing area. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague, Professor Gonzalez, come on stage to introduce the authors. Thank you.
Good afternoon. In Colm Tóibín's new novel, House of Names, a mother exacts revenge on her husband for sacrificing their daughter to the gods. The murderous mommy is Clytemnestra, wife of Agamemnon, the Greek commander-in-chief in the Trojan War. If you've ever read or heard of Homer's Iliad or Aeschylus's Orestia, you probably know the story. Mr. Tóibín retells it through the eyes of the three principals, Clytemnestra and her two surviving children, Electra and Orestes. Long before there was a red wedding, there was the red homecoming, thrown by Clytemnestra and her lover for her victorious spouse. Forget the Lannisters and the Targaryens. They were amateurs compared to the royal house of Atreus, whose motto could easily have been, an Etrusian always pays his or her debts. Mr. Tóibín is the latest in Ireland's never-ending contributions to literature. His books include Brooklyn, which was made into an Oscar-nominated film starring Saoirse Ronan, and The Testament of Mary, about a far less bloody-minded mother. Ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, I start? Okay. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Great. I'm going to read the first page of this book, which Clytemnestra is really very pleased with herself because she has just successfully murdered her husband, and the lover that her husband has taken back from the war is Cassandra. And she's really prepared this meticulously, and she's been really spurred on by the fact that before he went to the wars, he lured her and their daughter Iphigenia to the camp, telling her that he had a husband for their beautiful daughter, the warrior Achilles. But he didn't. What in fact he had planned was to sacrifice their daughter to the gods so the winds would change. He fooled her. And he didn't even have the courage to tell her himself when she arrived what he was going to do. She has utter contempt for him. And now she's managed to do what she planned so carefully. And so I'm going to read two things, and this is the opening of the book. I have been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy now for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures. And then as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there like an old friend come to visit. The smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting but are not dull now, eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that the body should remain in the open under the sun a day or two, until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger I had come to know too and come to appreciate. We are all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things. And this novel depends on revenge, it depends on a spiral of murder, it depends on something that once released cannot be contained again, which is that hunger that especially Clytemnestra, but also other characters feel for further murder. And it ends with the Clytemnestra who's spoken like that at the beginning of the book, but then very soon she's a woman on her way to a wedding in all innocence going with her daughter, and by this point now here she's dead, and she's been murdered by her only son Orestes, egged on by his sister Electra. It was really hard to know technically what to do. I mean, what do you do with a character when he's just murdered his mother? I mean, you know, if he lies all night awake, well, that's a sort of cliche. You know, does he eat his dinner? I mean, what does he do? Does he shiver? Does he look out the window? Is he sorry? Is he glad? Are all those emotions mixed in him? I mean, it's atrocious. But what I decided to do was just to deal with the problem by having his mother return immediately, that she doesn't remember how she was killed, and she's not looking for revenge. So she comes back from the dead as a ghost, and she's looking for something else in the world, not revenge. She remembers vaguely that she was killed on the way down to a garden, that there was a garden involved somewhere. She also remembers that she's the daughter of Leda, who was raped by Zeus, who came in the form of a swan. And these things are vague memories for her. Everything's a vague memory for her. She's desperately trying to stay in the world for as long as she can in this sort of funny aftermath, which won't last. So this is her speaking from the dead. There will come a time when the shadows fold in on me. I know that. But I'm awake now, or almost awake. I remember some things, outlines come to me, and the faint sound of voices. What linger most are traces of people, presences, sounds. Mostly I walk among the shades, but sometimes a hint of someone comes close, someone whose name I once knew, or whose voice and face were real to me. Someone I once loved, perhaps, I'm not sure. There's one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother at some point in the distant past. She's helpless, being held down. I can hear cries, her cries, and the shriller cries of a figure above her or lying on her, and then louder cries as the figure flits away, a figure with beak and wings, with the shape of wings, the wings beating in the air. My mother lying breathless, whimpering. But I do not know what this means or why it comes to me. I feel that if I remain still, something more will come. It is hard not to wander in these spaces when there is silence. There are presences I wish to encounter, presences that are close but not close enough to touch or be seen. I cannot think of the names, their names. And I cannot see faces clearly, although there are moments when I've been quiet, when I've made no effort for some time to remember or focus. Moments when a face approaches, the face of someone I've known, but it fades before it becomes anyone I can recognize. I know that there was feeling, and that is the difference between where I am now and the place I was once. There was a time, I know, when I felt rage and I felt sorrow, but now I have lost what leads up to rage and sorrow. Maybe the only reason I wander in these spaces has to do with some other feeling, or what is left of it. Maybe that feeling is love. There is someone whom I love still, or have loved and protected, but I cannot be sure of that. No name will come. Some words come, but not the words I want, which are the names. If I can say the names, I will know then whom I loved, and I will find them, or know how to see them. I will lure them into the shadows when the time is right. No one in their world knows how little there is here. It is all blankness, strangeness, silence. Hardly anything moves. There are echoes like distant water flowing under rock. And sometimes that sound comes nearer, but it is still faint. If I listen too eagerly, it disappears. Maybe there are things that did not come to an end when I was there, and they linger now like words that need to be said, or words that have escaped me and will come, or might come, or must come as I wait here. It will take time. I do not know how much time I have or how much time there is. But I know that I must fade, that I cannot persist in this state. The fading will be gradual. By the end, I will not know anything. What I'm hoping for is one more surge, some hours or even moments, when I will go back into the world and settle into it briefly as though I were alive. In the meantime, there's memory, which connects and attaches and withdraws. It is almost something. The vague thought hovers, but is never stable. Like a figure with wings, it edges towards what has been or was. I live on the inside of what has substance. I can feel some large set of pressing desires brushing past. All I am left with, though, are the grey traces, the clues. This must be what shadow is like, or aftermath, some lines or shapes that must have made sense at one time, or may still make sense but seem random now. If only I could follow what their intention was, or whisper to whoever made them. That desire is the closest I have come to pure feeling, and it is not close at all. I will be left here for the hours or days or years I have been allotted, no longer than that. Being perplexed and bewildered replaces truth and knowledge, replaces what is real and tangible. The space I inhabit is like a sad gift that was offered, but will soon be withdrawn. And then a word occurred to me. A word of which I was sure it was the word dream. Once the word came, I knew what dream was or had been, and I was certain then that I was not dreaming in this nullness, that none of what is happening is dream, it is real, it is actual. And then other words appeared like stars in the darkening sky. I became desperate to take possession of each one, but I could not hold on to them. They were falling or glittering or moving further away. It was enough, however, to have seen them, to get some idea of their power and know that some of them would return, like light from a full moon on a dark night, become part of the shadowy stability that was guiding me. I walked in the corridors of that palace where I had once lived. I could remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or on steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing. Just stillness in the garden. And then there was not even a garden, there was merely a space. But I was still awake. I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be once I was in those corridors again for one of the guards to notice me if I made a sound or if I moved quickly, so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then, slowly, I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me, and I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me or had noticed my presence, consulting one of the other guards, then both of them approaching him, the one I am searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter, they have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I am searching for is my son. I'm awake, the words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know the silence that descends on the gardens and corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movements of the guards or of cats. This is my realm where I'm free to wander. As I come from the garden, I'm aware that the guards can feel a movement in the air. It would just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them, a sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name, my son's name, enough to whisper it, like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Orestes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Orestes, I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corners. I waited until they had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Orestes that I'm his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but then stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Orestes to come alone," I said. "Now?" he asked. "Soon. Orestes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No, I do not mean to cause him harm." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
The Spanish Civil War was an agonizing defeat for progressives in Europe and in this country. With the help of Hitler and Mussolini, General Franco imposed a fascist regime that outlived the Nazis by almost a generation. In her new novel, There Your Heart Lies, Mary Gordon reimagines that violently polarized era. Her heroine is a disaffected American Catholic woman who goes to Spain to fight a grotesque ideology which unfortunately is still with us, as attested by the recent rise in sales of tiki torches. There is no genre Miss Gordon has not mastered. Novels, short stories, essays, memoirs, a study of Jesus, always written with clarity, precision, and a deft prose style that enlightens as much as it entertains. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Gordon.
Thank you, Ariel. So I'm going to begin from the beginning when my character, can you hear me all? Will you do me a favor and wave if you can't? No, just hi. Just wave. It's lonely up here. So my character, who is Marion Taylor, who is 19, is about to get on the ship that's going to take her to Spain to be a medical volunteer on the side of the Republic, which is the Republicans were the left. It's a little confusing. He offers her a coat. She takes it, making a cradle of her arms. Shy, small, scurrying, he backs away. She sees him take his place beside the man with the megaphone. All of them are standing on the pier, some of them like her, waiting to board the SS Normandy, pride of the French line, which will carry them to France. But they will not stay in France. It's Spain they're bound for. Medical volunteers to serve the army of the Republic, to defeat the fascists, Franco's rebels, nearly a year after the coup against the democratically elected government. The man with the megaphone is getting ready now to speak. Ben Gold, president of the Fur and Leather Workers Union. She can't concentrate on his words. She's looking at the beautiful ship, the Normandy, the newest, the fastest, the most glamorous of the great ocean liners. It seems wrong to be traveling on a ship famed for its luxury when they are not on holiday. They are going to Spain to work beside the men who are fighting for its freedom. This is what the man with the megaphone is saying, but she can't keep her eyes off the three huge black and red striped funnels, the three layers of what seems like a gigantic cake, dark blue on the bottom, the lacy center, rows of slender columns glistening like packed sugar in the uninflected sun. The open top deck, gleaming silver, everything capped by a stiff equilateral triangle whose only purpose seems to be the support of red, white, and blue pennants that snap extravagantly in the warm spring wind. She's afraid there's something wrong with her. Perhaps she doesn't deserve to be here because only scraps of what the union president is saying get hold of her attention. Fellow workers, victorious over the fascists, a war not only of the proletariat against the capitalists, a war of the poor against the rich, the people will prevail, the people of Spain, and the freedom-loving Americans, men and women of courage. He holds up a coat which the small man beside him provided at a secret signal. And so, to show you our support, the workers of our union, as a token of our esteem, present each of you brave ladies with the fruits of our labor, a fur coat for each of you, compliments of the Fur and Leather Workers Union. Wear them to victory, the victory of the people, the workers, the makers of the great new world. She understands now why she was given the coat. Marion strokes the rich, hot fur, not mink, not sable, nothing like her mother's coat, which she had loved to put her face against, hiding in her mother's closet, breathing in the scent, part of the warmth, the darkness of her mother's perfume, ambre rose, rose shadow, rose shade. What is this fur? Fox, perhaps, or muskrat? It is May and warm, but she puts the coat on. It would seem ungrateful not to wear it. She's glad to have it, although she's afraid it will make her sweat. This fur does not smell of perfume. It's not possible, as it was with her mother's coat, to forget that this was once the covering of an animal. Everyone claps and cheers for the man with the megaphone. Some of the women are crying. One says, "I never thought I'd have a fur coat. I never even dreamed of it." Marion takes her husband's arm. He says, "You okay?" "Never better," she says. Because it's the most wonderful feeling in the world to know that you're doing exactly the right thing, that you're exactly where you're meant to be, which is also where you want to be, that you are 19, healthy, on the way to Spain to save the world, married, free of your parents. And if the marriage is a sham, isn't that part of the fun of it? A secret they can giggle over in their bed instead of making love. After all, they love each other. They're each other's favorite person in the world. What a surprise, what a shock for her family that Marion Therese Taylor of the Newport and Park Avenue Taylors is here on this ship with people she calls comrades. Now Marion Rabinowitz, wife of Russell, one of what her family nastily refers to as the chosen people. Her husband Russell, former lover of her brother, dead by his own hand. But she won't think of that now. She must not think of Johnny now. It's why she's here, with people who've believed that there are more important things in the world than private life, that the large sorrows of the world are more important than the private sorrows, that the great murderous injustices are more important than the intimate and individually killing slights. She feels a hand on her arm, not gentle, but not unfriendly. It is Marcia Levitt, almost a friend, a nurse from Pittsburgh. "There's a meeting in the dining room of all the women. You need to be here." "Yes, of course," Marion says. There are 24 women on their way to Spain on the ship, and they're gathered in the dining room, 6 tables of 4. Ruth Lipsky, head nurse of the largest hospital in San Francisco, stands and claps her hands for silence. Ladies, shall we all agree that before we leave, we will present to the workers on the ship the lovely coats that our comrades, the furriers, have so kindly given us. It will be better not to have fur coats in Spain, and we will be bringing happiness to the wives or mothers or sweethearts of the workers who have made our journeys so pleasant. All the women clap. Not one disagrees. How wonderful they all are. Marion has never met people like them. Once again, she knows the rightness of her choice in the new way, from the happiness she feels, the sense of rightness in her skeleton, in the sparkling nerves at the tips of her fingers. She is with people who look closely at the suffering of the world, with people who take the ideas she had, the vague ideas of a privileged girl, and make them real. But a few days before they land, Ruth says, "Let's face it, girls, the coats are falling apart." Marion didn't want to admit it at first. She wore the coat on deck in the early mornings or when the sun went down. All the girls did, and then one by one they stopped. No one spoke about it, but Marion assumed that what had happened to her coat had happened to others. It is 3 a.m, and she wakes from one of her bad dreams. She moves to the closet to throw on some clothes. She doesn't want to turn the lights on, doesn't want to wake Russell. She reaches for her fur coat, which she will wear over her pajamas to walk on the deck. She feels for her shoes. Then the sole of her bare foot touches something that makes her scream in fear and disgust. She jumps back onto the room's one chair. Russell wakes. "What the hell?" he asks. She's mortified that he has discovered the one fear she has not been able to keep back. She has been horrified by rodents even since, in her Uncle Bill's cabin in the Adirondacks, she was 8 or 9. She bent down to get something from the bottom drawer of a dresser, and a mouse jumped into her face. Since then, even the sight of a rodent turns her into the kind of girl she has always despised. "There's a mouse in my shoe." He turns on the light, walks to the tiny closet, and takes her sensible brown penny loafer in his hand. "Not a mouse, sweetheart. Nothing living. I'm afraid it's your coat." He hands her the coat. She sees he's right. The fur is falling out in patches as if it had caught some disease on the ship. "Go back to sleep," she says. "I'm going on the deck." He kisses the top of her head, but she sees he's ready to fall back to sleep, and she's glad. Maybe he'll think he dreamed the fur in her shoe. Maybe he'll forget it. She throws the clump of fur into the ocean, so distressed that the kindness, the generosity of the furriers has come to this. And what of the plan of presenting fur coats to the workers on the ship, the lovely idea of giving them something they could use to surprise their sweethearts, their wives, their mothers? A lovely idea disintegrating like the clumps of fur thrown overboard when no one is watching. "I wonder what the hell animals they used," Marcia Levitt says when Ruth acknowledges the problem with the coats. "Maybe they used collected dead cats or sick rabbits." Irene Rothman bangs her hand down hard on the table. "Our comrades did what they did from the nobility of their hearts, from their devotion to the revolution. Remember, you are here because you are on the side of the workers." "I'm here because I'm a nurse," Marcia says. The way Irene Rothman looks at Marcia frightens Marion. Growing up in her family, she knows a hunger to punish when she sees it. "Enough, girls," says Ruth Lipsky. "Bring your coats here tonight, all of you, just after midnight. They will be redistributed." At midnight, stealing away from their husbands' beds, those who have husbands, they drop their coats in a pile, saying nothing to each other, and silently make their way back to their cabins, hoping they've not been seen. No one wants to ask what Ruth Lipsky meant by redistributed. They will present a united front because they are united in their devotion to the idea of a great new world, in their devotion to the cause of Spain. Well, finally, she arrives at Madrid and works with her husband, who is an infectious disease doctor in a hospital. She has had very little training, a course in first aid. She trains with the young Spanish girls. Everything is terrible. The stink from gangrene is the worst, and then the unbearable sights, guts open to the air, sores putrefying with maggots in them. Worst of all is the exhaustion, the bone-crushing exhaustion, exhaustion like a magnifying glass that enlarges and distorts. The constant ache behind the eyes, the lids demanding to be closed, and the struggle against them. No, you will not close, you will not close. If she falls asleep doing something essential, the consequences will be enormous. For days, she longs for sleep, as someone might long for water or food or love. Besides the physical exhaustion, there's the exhausting rage of the shortage of supplies, the having to make do against impossible odds, operations done when the power goes out, which it often does, by everyone making a circle with flashlights, or when the batteries run out with candles, rewashing bandages until they fall apart, having to ration sniffs of ether. Perhaps that is worse, she thinks, the shock of reawakening. And hunger, something she had never imagined for herself, a hunger so fierce that food becomes not only an obsession, but a terror. She dreams not of sex or of flying, but of food. She dreams of the new bread their cook baked in her parents' kitchen in Newport. She fears most of all that she will do something unforgivable for food. Suppose she fights a child for a crust of bread. Suppose she steals a piece of cheese from a dying man. And the bombing, another new way of being alive, a new way of being alive that it is impossible to make sense of because time means nothing that is in any way familiar. Everything seems to be happening at once. Events pile up on top of one another like the stones from the destroyed buildings. Always your mind is tumbling over itself. You forget what came first, whether you saw the boy with the green eyes screaming for his mother on Tuesday or Wednesday. She is doing so many different things because she's trained for nothing. Mostly she carries stretchers. And was it Tuesday or Wednesday that she saw the child with its head on its dead mother's breast? A girl child, maybe 4 or 5, her skirt up around her head so you couldn't see her face, but you could see the sex, so vulnerable but lovely, a little cleft like a clean washed up shell. Marion couldn't bear that people would be looking, so the first thing she did before she checked the pulse, although she knew the child was dead, was to pick her up gently as if she were her mother or as if she were reassuring the mother, and then to pull the child's skirt down so she is modest in her death, so she will not be looked at in a way that dishonors her further. But what's the difference? She's a dead child, a murdered child. What's the possible meaning of honor? But she will not let this child be shamed in death. Despite the horrors, sometimes there are moments when the beauty of the world, the miracle of drawing breath can pierce her, and the rind is pulled back, some skin exposed, vulnerable, like the skin after a burn. She and Russell go to the railroad station, which has miraculously not been bombed. It presents, despite everything, the possibility of holiday pleasure. The murals made up of small mosaic tiles, flowers, fruits, women carrying baskets on their heads. The windows are Moorish in shape. The panes are midnight blue. Columns support the ceiling, lime and peach with gold borders. The roof is glass, a crystal palace, and the light it lets in always seems joyous. You see, Russell, she says, this is why we're here, because there is something good in human beings, something that wants ornament, that wants blue glass and pink and green tiles that turn into flowers, all that work just to say life is good. There was no money for it then. Maybe it should have been going into the mouths of the workers, he says. It's the only time she gets angry at him. Why do you have to smash the hopeful things? Why do you have to spoil the moments that let us make sense of being alive? She understands why Russell dislikes the modernista architecture. If what pleases you are the spare lines of the new buildings of New York, the lacy facades of Valencia would seem at best frippery, at worst trash. Perhaps none of the comrades would approve if she said she enjoyed the half-mad Rococo facade of the Ceramics Museum, gods lounging in extravagant indolence, bruisers curled in on themselves like sleeping babies, draped in girlish leaves and lace. They would point to the striking beauty of the skyscraper, the rightness of the Bauhaus. But why, she asked them, why do you have to choose? Can't you be thrilled by the Empire State Building and love the Ceramics Museum? She wants to tell him that she reminds her of her father and his implacable Catholic insistence on the orthodoxy of taste. She wants to tell them, don't you see it is the cause of suffering, saying, if this, then not that? Why, she wants to ask, can't you have some of both? But she knows when life and death are at stake, you can't afford that kind of soft middle. Of course she knows that the decorative richness of the ornamented buildings is based on slave labor. She supposes that knowledge should render them to her unlovable, but it does not, and there is no one with whom she can share her troubled loves. Perhaps not her love for the smiling stone angels on the cathedral facade. She doesn't love the cathedral's interior, and she hasn't the slightest shred of anything but rage-filled aversion for the church as an institution. But the angels, the calm saints, their impassive, half-smiling faces, is it wrong for her, in her daily exhaustion, in her despair at the suffering she has been able to do so little to assuage? Is it wrong to look, just for a moment, at those cool, sweet expressions and to believe that someday it will be all over, someday life will go on in a way that these stone faces might recognize? Thank you.
Russell Banks is no stranger to Miami. His novel, Continental Drift, is rightly considered one of the finest books set in South Florida. In his fiction, Mr. Banks is committed to depicting unpleasant truths, such as racism and domestic violence. But in his latest work, Voyager Travel Writings, he puts make-believe temporarily aside in order to share his well-stamped passport with the public. An accomplished wanderer, he takes us on a tour of the Everglades, the Caribbean, Alaska, and the Himalayas, which I believe he crossed off his bucket list at the age of 72. Here you will meet hippies and Hummers, dictators and divorcees, all mediated by a fiercely observant narrator. Please welcome Russell Banks.
It is subtitled Voyager. It's subtitled Travel Writings, and but it is also very much memoiristic. But I think most travel writing is. It's a way for a writer to both write a memoir and avoid writing a memoir at the same time. Whether teller or listener, to get a story straight, which is, after all, one of the things I'm trying to accomplish here, one has to go back to its beginnings. Last April, my Miami friend, the poet Tom Healy, and I were biking the overseas highway from Key Largo to Key West and return, 2.5 days, about 200 miles of pedaling, when the past, or a crucial part of the past, came unexpectedly back to me. It was a tough ride. The 7-mile bridge between Knights Key and Little Duck Key was the worst of it. Our bikes squeezed on the right by a low guardrail, while 18 inches off our left shoulders, semis and RVs and tourist-laden cars blew by. 50 feet beneath the bridge, the ultramarine waters of Florida Bay merged with the turquoise-blue Gulf of Mexico. It was very humid, in the mid-80s, with a 15-mile-an-hour headwind and only occasional cloud cover. At least once a year, especially since moving to Miami 4 years ago, I've driven down the overseas highway by car to visit friends or participate in the annual Key West Literary Seminar. So I was surprised to find myself deeply and oddly stirred by traveling the same route on a bike at ground level. Then I remembered. 53 years ago, a wheezing, round-shouldered 1950s Greyhound bus from Miami dropped me off at a single-pump gas station in the fishing village of Islamorada. The bus lumbered back onto the overseas highway, Old Route 1, and headed for Key West, 80 miles beyond. I was lugging all my worldly possessions in an olive green Army surplus duffel. I hefted the duffel to my shoulder and crossed the now empty road to a two-story Bahamas-style rooming house with a wide porch that faced the highway. I was certain of that much. Those images were clear. But the rest of my memories of those early months in Islamorada and then later in Key West were vague and uncertain, even as to when I was there exactly and for how long. I know that I was very young at the time, in my early 20s. I tried telling the story to Tom, but couldn't get it right. I must not have been paying attention back then, or else paying attention to everything that wasn't worth remembering now, more than a half-century later. I used to tell people that it happened in 1962 or 63 when I was 22 or 23, but a few years ago, I gave a reading from a recently published novel at the Booksmith, a bookshop in Brookline, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. It was one of the several stores and restaurants and contractors that had given me part-time employment in the early 1960s. It was a nostalgic event for me and a kind of triumphant homecoming. And I told the audience that many years ago I had quit my job at the bookstore and hitchhiked alone down to Miami and ridden a bus out to the Florida Keys, where I rented a tiny Airstream trailer in Islamorada, pumped gas part-time to pay the rent, and began to write my first short stories in the cool shadow of Ernest Hemingway, whom I associated with the Keys, although he had long since moved on to Cuba. It was a story I had told many times whenever asked how I began my life as a writer. Although unsure of the exact date, I usually added that later that year Hemingway shot himself, as if to imply a slightly melodramatic connection between me, the apprentice writer, and Ernest Hemingway, the doomed master. Later, while I was signing copies of my book at a table, a man appeared in line, a bony guy in his late 70s, slouch cap, thick mustache, Irish face. He leaned in and whispered, "That ain't how it happened, Russ. That bit about you and the Keys." Anyone who called me Russ was someone from my distant past, from before I divorced Christine and became Russell. I recognized him at once, Joe Kerr, a.k.a. Joker, who back in the early 1960s rounded up young Boston artists and beatniks like me and my friends to work as carpenters and stagehands in amphetamine-fueled 30-day bursts for the Opera Company of Boston. Joker was a likable guy who we all knew was a small-time but well-connected mobster. We were his non-union scabs. "I'll be across the street at the TAM," he said. "Come on over when you're done signing. I'll tell you what really happened." Joker told me over drinks at the TAM that back then I was having a nervous breakdown, he called it, over a dame named Christine who'd left me for another guy. I couldn't get out of bed and come into work, he said, so the bookstore manager fired me. "You was crying like a fucking baby, man." It was the winter of 1961, he said. Same year Hemingway stuck his shotgun in his mouth, not 62 or 63 like you said. Joker had taken pity on me and sent me down to the Florida Keys to work with some associates of his who were helping train Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. He said he had helped get Rose LaRose, the famous stripper, out of Havana when Castro closed down the nightclubs in '59, and he was still tight with the Miami mob. "You were a smart kid, Russ. You would have made a pretty good gangster," he said, and laughed. "I made some calls and set you up at that rooming house in Islamorada where the Miami and CIA guys were staying. But I guess you got scared or something and moved the fuck out. They told me you disappeared. That's probably when you started being a writer," he said. "But it didn't have nothing to do with Hemingway." There are three interwoven underlying contexts to the story: the personal, the social, and the historical, as there are to all stories, true or not. The personal context, that weepy, disabling end of a love affair with a girl named Christine, was deeply embarrassing to me, somehow weirdly shameful, and I had forgotten it so that later I could develop and elaborate the social context and make it into myth, the old story of a young artist's solitary, dedicated apprenticeship in the shadow of a doomed living master. The historical context, Miami mobsters working with the CIA to arm and train Cuban exiles for the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. Looking back now, surely the most interesting part of the story I left out altogether. It would have diminished the romantic, self-embellishing myth of how, in following Hemingway's suicidal footsteps in the sands of the Florida Keys, I became a writer. Because I was mainly interested in shaping how I was perceived by others, by that audience in the Booksmith in Brookline, for instance, I literally forgot what really happened. Personalized myth displaced personalized historical reality until the night in the bookshop and at the TAM when Joker made me want to get my story straight. Were Joker's Miami mob guys really rooming at the four-square wooden two-story building with the long porch while they and a CIA cohort trained the Cuban exiles? Or was Joker a storyteller himself making it up? I have no memory of the men individually, but I do have a clear visual memory of the building and of some Americans living there, images recently freshened by my bike ride down the Keys with my pal Tom. The images, however, seem to have been drawn not from lived experience, but from my memories of a movie or a play in which a group of people, mostly men, are trapped in a hotel bar by a hurricane. At first, I thought the images might have come from To Have and to Have Not with Bogart and Bacall, the film version of the 1937 Hemingway novel set in Havana and Key West. Then, as Tom and I rode our bikes past the old, remarkably unchanged rooming house in Isla Mirada, I realized that I was remembering images from a different movie, Key Largo. Did it really happen to me, the hurricane, being trapped in the hotel with a bunch of gangsters? Or did I merely see it in a movie? Or did I imagine it? Or dream it? And if it did happen, why, after a month or so, did I leave the hotel and the gangsters and the CIA agents and rent a little trailer across the road? Tom is gay and was convinced that Joker had been a gay gangster with a crush. No house, no wife in Boston in the late 50s, early 60s, providing non-union workers for the Opera Company of Boston by hiring handsome young artists and writers to make sets and be stagehands. It was an opera company, Tom pointed out, not a waste disposal company. Give me a break, Russell. A gay Irish mobster? Well, yes, it was possible. And if so, I was too oblivious to have guessed it. But why else would Joker want to help a broken-hearted kid having a nervous breakdown over a busted romance by sending him off to train Cuban exiles in the Keys with his mobster friends so the kid could maybe become a mobster himself? Joker's little mobster. And could it really have been that early, the winter of 1961, in time for the Bay of Pigs, an event that at the time seemed to have escaped my notice, or had no memory of anyhow? As Tom and I pedaled on, I did the numbers. I needed to establish when exactly this happened. I'd fallen in love with Christine when she was a student at Emerson College, and I was living on Symphony Road in Boston, working part-time at the bookstore and the Rathskeller restaurant and in binges at the Opera Company of Boston. She left me for another boy, ran off with him to finish college in Richmond, Virginia. I remembered pumping gas at the filling station in Isla Mirada next to my Airstream on Old Route 1. Then at some point I left Isla Mirada and rented a room by the week at a whorehouse in Key West that took me 2 weeks or more to figure out actually was a whorehouse. Key West was a Navy town then, and I was very naive and, as I said, oblivious. I was writing my neo-Hemingway short stories and paying more attention to my sentences than to my surroundings. I remembered that a few months later, I delivered a drive-away Opel picked up in Miami to its owner in San Diego by way of northern Mexico with an extended stopover in New Orleans, accompanied by 2 guys who ran a card game at the Key West whorehouse. Frank, a strip show barker recently released from jail in New Jersey, and an AWOL sailor from Oklahoma whose name I can't remember. I stayed for a few weeks in San Diego, where my mother had recently moved, then hitchhiked back east to New Hampshire. Temporarily reconciled with my father, I moved in with him and his new wife, where he was living in his parents' home in Barnstead, and began working alongside him as a union plumber, the bank's family trade for 3 generations. Returning to Boston the following summer, I renewed my relationship with Christine, and October 29, 1962, married her. The marriage did not last as long as we hoped, of course. They never do. That is, mine never do. But the date is indelible, part of the record. So the numbers confirmed it, yes. I was in Islamorada in April 1961, which is when the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred, and I must have been frightened by whatever was happening before my eyes, which I could not have understood. So I fled the rooming house and the men living there, abandoning the life of a gangster for the life of a writer in an Airstream trailer just across the road. And the rest became my more sharply remembered life: Key West, New Orleans, Mexico, San Diego, New Hampshire, a second early marriage, college in North Carolina, Jamaica, and on. Still chasing down the imagery, at home in Miami, a few nights after my bike ride with Tom, I rented and watched the movie Key Largo. The film is adapted from the play by Maxwell Anderson. Richard Brooks and John Huston wrote the screenplay. Huston directed. Released in 1948, it starred Bogart, Bacall, Edward G. Robinson, Lionel Barrymore, and Claire Trevor. I'd forgotten the weirdly racist Seminole Indian aspect. It opens with a local sheriff looking for 2 young bucks who'd busted out of jail. The real action begins when Major McLeod, Bogart, arrives by bus at the Hotel Largo, a Bahamas-style wood-frame rooming house and bar with a long porch facing the road. He's come to keep a vow made to a guy in his outfit who was killed in Italy in the war. He's promised to visit the guy's wheelchair-bound dad, Barrymore, and gorgeous sister, Bacall, and report that their beloved son and brother died heroically in battle. Bogart finds the hotel taken over by a posse of American gangsters up from Cuba, led by Johnny Rocco Robinson, a short, round, cigar-chomping Capone type, there to meet some Miami mobsters and exchange a suitcase of phony money printed in Cuba for a bag of real cash when the hurricane hits. The wind rises to a roar, and then comes a strangely ominous scene in the hotel bar, where Robinson leans into Bacall and whispers something in her ear that the audience can't hear, something that frightens and repels her. She recoils, and he does it again. This time she spits at him and claws his face with her nails. Bleeding, he backs off. Throughout the scene, Bogart stands and watches from the bar, but does nothing. The scene is ugly and realistic in a way that the rest of the movie is not. The rest is operatic and stagey. But for me, that exchange between Robinson and Bacall carries the emotional and moral meaning of the film. Everything seems to hinge on whispered words that we never hear. We're invited to imagine the filthiest, most degrading words possible. It was shocking and frightening and deeply felt by me in a way that nothing else in the film was. When did I first see Key Largo? Not when it was released in 1948. I was only 8 years old. It's possible, of course, that I saw it a year later at the Star Theater in Concord, New Hampshire. I went to the movies at least once a week starting when I was 9, regardless of what was showing. But at that age, what, if anything, would I have made of Edward G. Robinson's whispering into Lauren Bacall's lovely ear? The scene might have frightened me, but only a little. Bacall's response would have frightened me more. A beautiful young woman reacts violently to an ugly man's unheard words by spitting at him and scratching his face with her nails. It's more likely that I watched the film for the first time many years later, after I'd actually lived in the Keys in the 1980s, late at night on the Turner Classic Movies channel, and just recently, prompted by my bike ride down the Keys with my friend Tom, when I watched it again, this time via Netflix, and it became clear that the scene with Robinson and Bacall was the emotional and moral center, not just of the movie, but of my all but forgotten long ago months in Key Largo. but I couldn't be sure of the differences between what I remembered experiencing in 1961 and what I saw decades later in the movie. They flowed together like Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico under the 7 Mile Bridge and elaborated and extended each other. This time, the movie stirred up a wave of impacted and disturbing and mysteriously mingled memories, all brought on by Joker's revelations at the TAM and the bike trip with Tom years later. Lived experience first, then a long half-century of forgetting, then a willed return to the location and to the film, followed, as I write, by these overflowing memories, making it possible for my early lived experience to be relived now in my mid-70s. Almost relived, for at the very center there floats a small opaque gray circle, an absence behind which something shameful lies hidden. It's what no one hears Robinson whisper in Bacall's perfect ear. It's what I imagine he said to her, something I myself must have said to a beautiful young woman, to Christine, driving her into the arms of another, a man standing at the bar, watching like Bogart. She evidently forgave me, or she would not have married me, but I cannot remember what I said to her, and can neither imagine nor acknowledge it, and thus cannot be truly forgiven. All I can call up today is the emotional residue, which is shame. Guilt dissipates over time. Shame, like a man's character, stays. When Tom and I biked our way back from Key West to where we had left the car in Key Largo, we pulled off at the old place in Islamorada. Freshly painted, it looked the same outside as it did 54 years earlier, except for a resort wear boutique and a real estate office on the first floor and what appeared to be a rack of studio apartments upstairs. I stepped into the real estate office and spoke to the realtor, a pretty, very pregnant young Hispanic woman with frizzy dark hair seated in front of an electric fan. I asked her if the building used to be a bar and rooming house. She said that was before her time. But yes, she'd heard it was once a roadhouse, where a lot of bad things happened, she added, smiling. Except for her office and the boutique next door, it was condos now. There's one available, she told me, an N unit. Just came on the market. A view of the Gulf on one side and Florida Bay on the other. Would I be interested in seeing it? I hesitated a few seconds, then said no, and Tom and I mounted our bikes and rode on.
We have about 15 minutes left, and so I do want to give audience opportunity to ask questions. I think we can probably handle 3 questions. So anybody have a question? Yes, please. Can you just
There's
have
a mic here.
there's a microphone for you.
Thank you very much for all your readings. I really enjoyed them. I read Column's book, Brooklyn, and I loved it very much, but I didn't see the movie. I would like his opinion of the movie. So I haven't seen it. I don't know if I should see it, if they changed it too much or what.
Oh, yeah, Nick Hornby, who I wanted to write the screenplay, he brought the ending to a sort of more natural conclusion than I did. I sort of stopped the novel, so you could imagine, you could put the book down and imagine what happened next. I think the pact you make if you're a filmmaker with an audience is that you spell things out much more, and that you can't just do that. And I understood what Nick was doing. The problem I have is that I've seen the film about 6 or 7 times, and that's the part that makes me cry. The part I wrote myself, I just say, right, I know what that is. The part that Nick wrote, all the emotion comes, and so it was an absolutely painless experience, and it was, that's the only real change. I mean, there were cuts made, but it wasn't. It was made by someone who's also a novelist, so if he needed to write his own story, he has every opportunity to do so, but he was very faithful to my book, and we were so lucky that just if we'd got the money 2 years earlier, which we were looking for. Saoirse would not have been old enough to play the part. But just as we got the money, she was coming to the right age where she'd never played an Irish character before. You know, and she's Irish, and she's done The Lovely Bones, Atonement, a lot of other movies as a child actress. But she was waiting for one script. She kept saying, you know, one script is going to come, and her first Irish script. And we were just really lucky that we hit her at exactly the right age, and that she was ready to do that. So it was just absolutely painless experience.
Okay.
Yes, it's good.
There's another lady here. Just a second. There's microphone coming.
Hi, Russell. I worked at the Paperback Booksmith in the early 60s, running the coffee shop there. So I think that I know you. And, and all these stories sound very familiar, traveling to Key West and Brookline, and I've also lived in New Hampshire. So just thank you very much, and I really enjoyed the reading.
Thank you.
Another question? Anyone? Yes.
I have one question for each of you. Should I ask them all at once, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, for Russell Banks, why travel? Why, you know, all of your wonderful novels, like why veer off in this direction? Was it just time?
Mm-hmm.
Why the Spanish Civil War? Like, what was the trigger for you? And I know that's part of the Hogarth. No, you're so. What is then? What led you to this, which is very different? And all your books are different, but this is more different. So, thank you.
You want to start?
Oh, well, I reached an age a few years ago where I decided I had a long view, and it was time perhaps to try to use that long view. And it did involve traveling. Most of my adult life I've spent traveling. In fact, starting when I was 18 years old and dropped out of school and hitchhiked down here in 1958, the winter of '58, and I thought I was on my way to help Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrow the hated dictator Batista, and I only got as far as Miami. But my life seems to have been marked by movement, travel, and I thought it was probably the most interesting way for me to engage the story of my life up to now. That was really what it was. I would not have tried or been that interested in writing a book like this when I was younger. It really did need to get to my mid-70s or so.
I was interested in the Spanish Civil War as a complex narrative. So I was brought up in an extremely, it's hard for people to believe this, but I was brought up in an extremely conservative Catholic family in which Franco was considered a hero, that Franco was saving the church, that Franco was saving the world from communism. And then I went to Columbia in the 60s, and all I heard was that the communists in the Lincoln Brigade were saving the world for democracy. I was brought up hearing nuns were raped, priests were killed. And in 1967, I heard no nun was ever raped, no priests were ever killed, communists were saving the world for democracy. And then I read George Orwell, How Much Catalonia, and he said, no, the Francoists were, of course, horrible, the communists were even worse, and the anarchists were lovers of freedom and saving the world for democracy. And so I was really fascinated by these narratives, all of which could not have been true. And I was fascinated by the idea that you could say one side was definitely the worst, so that the Francoists were definitely the worst, because they were armed by Hitler and Mussolini. The communists were kind of forced into the arms of Stalin because nobody else was giving them any aid. But they were murderers too, and liars. And Hemingway, who's one of the biggest liars that ever lived, really covered that up.
Yeah.
And covered up some brutalities. Orwell, who's also a big fat liar, although everybody thinks he's a saint, covered up the brutality of the anarchists. And Hugh Thomas, who's the expert, the greatest living historian of the Spanish Civil War, has a footnote about Homage to Catalonia. And he said, Mr. Orwell has written an excellent book about war. It just doesn't happen to be this war. So I was fascinated by conflicting narratives, all of which couldn't be true. I was fascinated by a way of saying one is worse, but nobody was perfect. And then when I was writing about Simone Weil, she had fought with the anarchists, and she saw a young peasant boy whose parents were Francoists, and the anarchist said, if you will say in the morning that you're an anarchist, we'll let you live, otherwise we'll shoot you. And the boy woke up and said, I'm not an anarchist, and they shot him. And she left. And then I was also somebody else that's not good for my mental health, like Simone Weil, whom I love, is a writer, Georges Bernanos, and he was on the right and a very devout Catholic. And he said, I am appalled by the behavior of the Francoists, by the brutality in the name of the church. And so she went home and wrote for the left-wing press, there is so much blood on everyone's hands that it's impossible to say anything else. He wrote that for the right-wing press. They were both vilified. She wrote to him and said, you're a royalist, I'm an anarchist. I thought you were my enemy, you are my brother. So I thought, well, it's only great writers that can get to some semblance of truth in an untellable story. And I particularly thought, at this point in the history of the world, we need that kind of complexity and depth, because I think if the novel has any point at all, it's because it's the opposite of the soundbite, and it can encompass those. Also, I felt like everything that we knew about the Spanish Civil War, namely from Hemingway and Orwell, was from a male point of view. And there were a lot of women who also volunteered, and we had heard nothing about them. So that's kind of why.
I began to work with actresses when I wrote a monologue called The Testament of Mary. And Meryl Streep did the audio, and Fiona Shaw did the one version, and Marie Mullen in Ireland, and Blanca Portillo. Blanca Portillo in Spain complained about me that she said to the director, could that Irish guy stop sitting in the front row sort of staring at me with his mouth wide open? You know, because I was so astonished by what she was doing, by her wonderful performance, that I would go every night and just look at her. And she said it was just like, I'm trying to be the Virgin Mary, and could he just sit at the back or something? And it was, Fiona Shaw had a tougher way of dealing with me, but I became interested in that idea of voice, of how voice is achieved, of the way in which powerlessness can become power if it's transmuted into voice, especially by someone who might only speak once, who might not get another chance to speak. And I thought I knew the Electra story, and I thought I knew it until I realized that I had never read a late play by Euripides called Iphigenia in Aulis, which tells the story from Clytemnestra, from the mother's point of view. It was a big shock. And really what happened was that as soon as I read it, it came to me as rhythm, that I could put a narrative shape on it, and that I could work with that. And once that was done, then who would murder their own mother? What would you have to be if you weren't a psychopath? What sort of childhood would you have? What would impel you to do that? And I began to build the character of Orestes, the son. And it was gradual. I never intended to do it. If you'd told me 3 years ago or 4 years ago I was going to write this, I would have said, no, I'm going to write another sad Irish novel. And so it just came out of the blue. And it's my only visit, I think, to that territory. Thank you.
A question, can you hear me? From Mr. Toybin. Nora Webster. I'm about halfway through the audiobook, and I noticed that she's frequently saying she's thinking something or she wants to say something, then she decides not to say it. And I wonder what that is for you. I've never had a character so often have an impulse and then squelch it.
Nora Webster is the story of what happened in my house in the my house in the 3 or 4 years after my father died, and I was 12 when he died. But you just don't have enough sensibility. I mean, I could have written it as a set of short stories from my point of view, but I couldn't even see what I was thinking or feeling. I was feeling, they were so conflicted. What I was feeling was being so submerged in a way. So what I tried to do was imagine what my mother was thinking or feeling. But of course, in that situation, especially in Ireland in those years, you are silent about what you care about most. You do not say things. You do not assert yourself. So she's trying to rebuild her life, and it's being done within. It's all happening within herself. So that every time she is ready to speak, she first of all stops to think, can I speak? Should I speak? I was there. I saw it. I was in that silent house. I saw all those people coming. I didn't need to take notes, because after an absence like that, after loss, you notice everything so clearly in the few years after. You register everything. At least I did. And my younger brother did too, because we talked about it, but only once, many years later. The amount we'd noticed and watched. And so one of the things, I mean, the main thing we noticed and watched was that the thing that mattered most was not being discussed, and that many other things were not being discussed. And so that really is, as you say, the theme of the novel.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so let's give our authors another round of applause.
Thank you, too.